And we're live.
Hi, everyone. I'm MinnPost data reporter Greta Call with my colleagues Peter Callahan, Walker Orenstein, and Gabe Schneider here. You might know us all from MinnPost.com, where we cover politics and public policy in Minnesota. And we're here today to talk a little bit about a poll that we did for the first time as part of our elections coverage. MinnPost has never sponsored a poll, but this year we decided to throw it in as part of our coverage. And so here today we'll be talking a little bit about the results of that poll and sort of some of the interesting breakdowns on issues and regional breakdowns that we found in the poll. So I guess for starters, I should tell you all a little bit about the poll itself. It was a poll that we did with Change Research, which is an online polling firm. It was a survey of 1,021 likely Minnesota voters. It was done between October 12th and 15th, so just last week. Nothing crazy has happened in the campaign kind of before or after that would make us kind of wonder about it. Like, you know, when President Trump was tested positive for coronavirus, something like that could potentially change the poll if the poll is out in the field. But nothing too crazy happened last week. And the margin of error is 3.1 percentage points. The top lines, our poll found that 44% of likely Minnesota voters support former Vice President Joe Biden. 44% of likely voters support President Donald Trump. That was closer than any public poll recently had found the two candidates. It's within the margin of error, but far enough apart that it suggests that Biden does have an edge, statistically speaking. Jason Lewis and Tina Smith in the Senate race, the poll found that Smith had 48% of likely voters support compared to 44% for Jason Lewis. This was also the closest the two had been found in a public poll recently. KFCP has done some polling since then that's also found these races closer than other polls, especially in the Senate race, found that it was a dead heat. Gabe, do you have any thoughts on that, since you're the Washington correspondent and you're the one who kind of covers these races more closely?
Yeah, I mean, all of the polls that we were seeing in the prior months showed that Smith had a really, really healthy lead. So it was surprising to me to see her a couple points ahead. And then I think we recently saw a Survey USA poll that had Smith only, 1 point ahead. And I think that's pretty stunning. But I'm not sure, having seen all of those prior months of polling where Smith was just so far ahead, I'm curious to see if we get any other polling, how it averages out. And I remain skeptical that Smith is not ahead. And I think the last poll that just came out, which is a civics poll, had Smith ahead of 11 points, and it was a poll of 840 voters. So I remain skeptical, but I think it's a useful data point.
Do you want me to come in here since Greta's frozen? I think what's interesting too is that we wanted this poll to be deeper, and we know that people are generally interested in horse race stuff, so we asked the horse race stuff, but what we really did it for was to get deeper into some issues it was a pretty lengthy poll, and the fact that it was an online poll, I think, helped the response rates. But since we did it partially because of our greater Minnesota coverage, Walker, do you want to maybe talk about what you guys found on the differences regionally?
Yeah, so basically voters were really split by region. I mean, in the Twin Cities, Biden, very popular, Trump, astonishingly unpopular, really, really huge margins there in favor of the former vice president. In greater Minnesota, so we sort of did the 7-county metro counts as the Twin Cities, and everything outside of that, Trump was far more popular. I believe his favorable numbers were about 54% in favor. Likely voters said by about a 54% of likely voters said that they would pick Trump in greater Minnesota. And this didn't just follow just sort of the presidential candidates like who you would vote for, who do you favor. It was on all sorts of policy issues too, on trade policy, for instance, or supporting farmers, mining. People outside of the Twin Cities area just generally backed Trump and thought he did a good job and is doing a good job. And in the Twin Cities, it was the opposite, more or less. And in the suburbs, if you actually broke out just the suburbs, it was a little bit more split. Sometimes it would favor more towards Biden, a little bit more towards Trump on some things. But generally, one of the interesting things, though, is while there was big margins for Trump in outstate Minnesota, some political science professors we talked to said that his margins weren't sort of lopsided enough to make up for the fact that it was kind of a runaway train for Biden in the Twin Cities area. And so when you look at our overall results, and since Biden holds a small lead in the suburbs as well, right now it doesn't look like greater Minnesota favors Trump by enough for him to have that carry him to winning the state in our poll.
Yeah, and the other thing I wanted to do with our stuff was, and I looked at just COVID questions, was I was worried about having all of Ramsey and all of Hennepin be considered the Twin Cities, and then the other counties around those two large counties be called the suburbs, because there's so much suburb, particularly in Hennepin County, that I wanted to look at those results with the other suburbs and not the two cities. So we had them pull out Minneapolis and St. Paul city limits as the Twin Cities. And that allowed sort of suburban Hennepin County to be grouped with sort of the collar counties around those two. And I just felt that was a better number to look at. And then when we do it that way, I'm just going to ballpark the numbers. Twin Cities, it's probably 740,000 people. Suburbs, then were like going to be about 2.4, 2.5 million people. And the rest of the state was 2.2 million people. So Twin Cities it's not a one-third mix. But I just think it gave us a better number, and also just showed how starkly different results from Minneapolis and St. Paul are versus even the suburbs close in to the two cities. And if you gather them all together, the number you have a statewide number and a suburban number. Those percentages were almost exactly the same. And then you had Twin Cities so far to the left and the rest of greater so far to the right, that it again told me just kind of how representative the suburbs are of the sort of a statewide sample.
Yeah, I want to remind people who are watching here that you can ask questions on YouTube or on Facebook, but to Peter's point, I was looking at the map and I think there's about a million of these combined. So we don't want to group those people who are living in, all the way out to Rogers in with Minneapolis and St. Paul when they vote probably more like the rest of the suburbs in Carver County and Dakota County and Washington County and Scott County. So yeah. Anybody else have thoughts? We have some questions from readers already, but does anybody else want to? Oh, one thing I wanted to talk about while we're here that I didn't get to because my computer froze is looking at the issues. Did you guys talk about that at all while I was gone?
We did not.
No. So one of the things that was important to us about this poll was to get sort of beyond the horse race. And also talk about or be able to sort of look at what issues are important to voters. Is that presidential races in big are cited? They were asked what the issues. The one that came up for 47% of people who responded to the poll. It came up for the majority of men. It came up for the majority of people.
Okay, Greta, we lost you again. So I have a story posted today on just sort of the COVID questions.
Well, ages 35 to 49 and 50 to 64. And it also came up for the majority of people who saw a lot of messaging. Some people, crime in public among men and Republicans.
Okay, I heard about half of that. So what I was going to talk about was the COVID questions. And what I was looking at was that it looks like at this point in the campaign, Republicans, particularly in legislative races, are trying to make COVID and the response to COVID as a campaign issue. And as I said, it's either a Hail Mary or it's a argument that might help them in certain suburban, particularly swing districts, and in the handful of districts in urban centers, Rochester and St. Cloud area where there are battleground races. And the point being that Walz does have a majority of people in the state supporting him and his responses, but that breaks down much less in suburbs and much even more than that in greater. And then what the Republicans were trying to really go on was school reopening, school sports. Shouldn't we be able to go watch them? And particularly on that question, I was going to go and look at, do you support or oppose the following policies and groups? The question says, full-time in-person K-12 school resuming in your county, strongly support statewide 40%, somewhat support 17%. Going to Minneapolis and St. Paul only, strongly support 12%, somewhat support 9%, and go to rest of Minnesota beyond Twin Cities Metro, and it strongly support 40%, somewhat support 15%. So it is a potentially potent issue for them in both suburbs and greater if they make it a school reopening issue. It breaks down a little bit on other COVID responses, but again, it could be a Hail Mary pass for them at this point to try to come up with some issue that's going to move voters in those areas. But the poll result shows that it's at least maybe worth a shot for them in some of those districts.
We have a reader question here. The question is, does the strong early voting turnout in Minneapolis and St. Paul bode well for Biden and Smith? And I know Peter has talked a bit about this before, but the advantage of a strong early voting turnout is that you know that folks voted, right? It's that people might not actually show up on election day, but when someone's already turned in their ballot, that's a guaranteed vote prior, right? So that's the advantage. Beyond that, if folks show up, don't know if there's an advantage or a disadvantage to that. It depends. But that's the advantage, is just the guaranteed vote.
Yeah, and our poll results showed that the early vote is overwhelmingly Democratic vote. And the people who said they intended to vote on election day was overwhelmingly a Republican vote. If all things happen as they're supposed to happen, that shouldn't change the results necessarily. When you voted doesn't matter once all the votes are counted. But as I said, the one advantage is that GOTV campaigns are done for a reason. They are trying to make sure that people vote who otherwise might not vote. And if you can already check off that name from your GOTV lists and your call lists and your text lists, that's an advantage because it lets you target other folks. But as of now, it doesn't appear that there's any reason why election day turnout won't pull in the other likely voters, because the fear was that COVID was going to be running rampant and people would be frightful of going to polls. There's still time and there's still trends in infection rates that something like that could happen. But it doesn't at this point appear that people are going to be afraid to go to the polls.
I'll just say we have a reader question. It looks like, where can I see this poll? We have, I think 4 stories about the poll right now on our site, just MinnPost.com. In each one of them, or at least in several of them, we have posted the crosstabs, which shows sort of the breakdowns, more specifically, by region, by voter type of the state. And so that's sort of in an Excel spreadsheet that you can peruse. in more detail. But yeah, we have, I think, 4 stories now on the poll that should break it out pretty well on our website.
Yep, everything that we saw from the pollster, you can see in those stories. Just look for the hyperlink that says crosstabs here or something like that. Any other questions? Oh, we did not poll. There's a question here about the Minnesota Supreme Court race. We did not poll that question, so we don't have any data on that. I mean, those are weird races to begin with because, I mean, you could spend $1 million statewide in a campaign, and it really isn't very much. It doesn't really move that much. So those races really don't have much of a campaign. And as Justice Thiessen likes to tell people, or Tyson likes to tell people, it's on the back of most printed ballots. And it might be easy for someone to not flip it over. So his whole thing is make sure you turn the ballot over and look at these races. We really didn't go that deeply. And even though it's a good size sample, it's over, it's almost 1,100 sample. We didn't try to take out congressional districts. I just didn't feel that sample would have been big enough to give us a very good number in those races. So we didn't go into any subsets on say parts of the state like congressional districts, and obviously not legislative districts either.
I see a question about wondering if there's any indication of what voter turnout will be in Greater Minnesota. I guess I don't necessarily know like to the level that people will turn out, but we did poll how people are voting and how they plan to vote. And our breakdown right now is that in Greater Minnesota, only 31% of people who responded said that they already voted, and 67% said that they plan to vote but haven't voted yet. And in Twin Cities city limits, 59% of respondents said that they already voted. So we've already talked about this. There's a big split in how people plan to vote, but just by region, it's pretty interesting too. That's not necessarily just a party breakdown, but by region. And historically, there's generally some places in Greater Minnesota that have always done vote by mail or done vote by mail for a while. So it's an interesting breakdown as well. And I'll say our poll says 73% of people in Greater Minnesota who have not already voted said they plan to vote in person on election day. And only 15% said in Greater Minnesota that they plan to vote in person before election day. So that it's going to be a very big difference in how people plan to vote in the Twin Cities and in the suburbs. It's just definitely a little different.
I mean, there's also a breakdown in the poll of whether or not folks are concerned about voting in person. And when you get to Greater Minnesota, you only have about 15% of folks that say they have very serious concerns about voting in person. And then, that's compared to in Minneapolis and St. Paul, you have 37% that say have very serious concerns about voting in person. So that also obviously is going to affect that breakdown in terms of whether or not voting by mail or actually showing up to the polls.
There's a question here about state Senate, odds of taking the state Senate. As I said, we don't have any voter data on that, but we have been covering that. Walker and I particularly have been trying to write stories on that. And you're right in that the battlegrounds appear to be just outside the Twin Cities, Warren Limmer's seat and Curran Housley's seat, northwest and east of the Twin Cities, and then sort of urban centers, Senator Relf's seat up in St. Cloud, and the 2 Rochester seats, Carla Nelson and Senator Senjum, are the ones that just about everybody's watching to see if the DFL can pick up the 2 seats they need. And that's kind of where most of the attention is being played. We don't have any data on that. So your guess is maybe as good as ours. And Greta has made a cameo appearance.
I'm back. I had to switch to my phone because my internet decides to quit on me every time we do something like this, it feels like. So I'm back and hopefully it won't cut out again.
Hey, did you see a question in the questions about how does this poll deal with people who don't like to do polls, who don't respond to pollsters? Do you feel like you could respond to that?
Yeah, I think there are going to be some people, no matter what, who don't respond to pollsters. I'm one of them. I would never take a poll. But I think one of the things that people who do online polls tout about them is that like it's getting harder and harder to get people to pick up the phone these days. Everybody's screening their calls. Nobody wants to talk to strangers on the phone. It's especially hard to get young people on the phone. And so these types of online polls where they target people based on advertisements that you would see on a website, they're at least able to in a more sophisticated fashion, target people who are, say, like 18 to 34, and target people who are women more, or target people based on their partisan ID more, and stuff like that. The problem with it, people would say, is that it's not a random sample. Like when you get a list of random phone numbers and you dial every 10th number or whatever to make it a random sample. But it is able to potentially target people who might not be represented as well in other polls.
And can you look at that other question there, Greta, about the difference between a likely voter sample and an all voter sample, and what differences might come from that? And I'll throw in.
Is that like a likely voter versus a registered voter or something like that? Yeah. So likely voters should measure people who maybe haven't voted in the past but are planning to vote this year, whether it's because they're energized by the campaign, or because maybe it's their first time voting and they're 18, or they're 40 and they've never voted before, or something like that. If you just use a registered voter list, you're going to miss that segment of the electorate. I think that matters a lot more in some races than others. I mean, if we go back to like Jesse Ventura, a lot of people who voted for him were not registered to vote before. So in a race like that, which was a governor's race, obviously it could matter a lot. In other races, maybe there aren't so many people who weren't registered already who are going to vote, but I think it's a more representative sample of the electorate when you look at likely voters versus registered voters.
Yeah, it's hard. Sometimes it's a hard sample to get. I mean, you're basing this on some set of questions about someone's intention to vote. And generally, your people are going to say, yeah, I intend to vote, because that's kind of the civics answer. You know, you're supposed to vote. And so they'll usually try to get at some other methods to kind of get underneath that. How many times have you voted in the last 4 elections? Things like that. So it's not just a self-reporting. But if people are poll people, they're probably looking at 538.com, which is the Nate Silver site. And if you go there and look at all the polling that's going on, they will tell you the difference in the sample if you look at it. So it'll be 972 LV in that poll, so that's likely voters. And then you'll see an RV, and that's registered voters. So USC does a poll in which they do both. They do a sample that includes likely voters, and then they do one that includes registered voters. And the numbers can be different, but they're not super different. Like their last poll had Biden nationally plus 13 among likely voters, and Biden plus 10 among registered voters. So it is a different sample, and it can get you somewhat different results, but it doesn't. I've not noticed sort of a very stark one. And then you can also go there and you can see A. So they'll do all voters, registered voters, likely voters. So it's a different sample.
We have a question about whether or not we're going to continue polling at MinnPost future elections. And I don't know that any of us can answer that, but I will say that polling is very expensive. So if you want us to continue polling, I'll just do a quick plug and say that you should become a member, because polling is extremely expensive. And I think it would be nice to consistently do more polling, but we need more members.
Yeah, I think it was pretty fun to get a poll and sort of be able to do all that analysis. And it's definitely something that we'd like to do in the future, but we haven't heard, and that decision is way beyond our pay grade.
Greta, can you also look at maybe respond to the notion of weighting, particularly educational weighting this year versus 2016?
Yeah, so I'm guessing the person who asked that question remembers back to
That was
2016.
me. That was me, Greta. I asked that question.
You remember 2016
I
when
do, yeah.
pollsters got in a lot of trouble, in particular because there was a sense that they didn't weight very well for education in the polls, which might have been responsible for Clinton having a bigger edge in the polls than we ended up seeing in the election results. From what I've heard, pollsters have learned a lot from the 2016 election and are trying to do a better job of that. But who knows? Maybe they're weighting something else poorly this year. Every election's a little bit different, just sort of based on who ends up turning out to vote versus who pollsters think are going to turn out to vote. So,
right.
And I think
to be, but to also be more specific, they may have oversampled college-educated voters in 2016, and therefore undersampling one of the strengths of the Trump coalition, which was particularly high school level or not four-year college people in their sample, and that they missed a significant, and in a very close race in many states, you don't have to miss very many.
And this poll, to be specific here, weighted on gender, race and ethnicity, age, education, and the 2016 presidential vote. So we did have some weighting by education to try to make it look more like what the pollster thinks the electorate will look like this year. Trying to see.
And Walker, can you, I think people kind of either accept the divided state narrative or they want to reject the divided state narrative, sort of the one Minnesota concept. But our numbers certainly show that there is a opinion divide.
Yeah, definitely. And I think I talked more about the race for president, but there's an opinion divide on the governor too. Outstate Minnesota, his numbers are not doing very well on things like handling the pandemic, handling civil unrest in the Twin Cities. After George Floyd was killed by police, people in the cities generally give him decent marks, and then out in the suburbs on that particular issue, he got pretty bad marks, which is pretty interesting. I did try and find some things that people are more broadly supportive of, or at least agree on, I guess. And the mask mandate was less divisive than you might think. I think it was about 50-50 outstate, which was pretty interesting. Very, very, very popular in the Twin Cities, but still not unpopular across the whole state. One of the things that I found was interesting is we asked people whether they felt like their town and the state and the country were going in the right track or the wrong track, right direction or the wrong track. And overwhelmingly, for the most part, people said in Minneapolis and St. Paul and the suburbs and greater Minnesota that they felt like their town was going on the right track. They felt like the state, actually in the suburbs and in greater Minnesota, they felt like the state was going on the wrong track, whereas in the Twin Cities, it was the right track. And pretty much everybody said wrong track for the United States, which I thought was pretty interesting. And I guess people probably have different reasons they would give for why something's going on the wrong track. But in Twin Cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul, 92% of likely voters in our poll said the country's going on the wrong track. In the suburbs, it's 63. In greater Minnesota, it was 57. So a divide there, but less stark, it seems, than on some other issues. But yeah, by and large, things were pretty split. And we did look at a couple things divided by the northern half of the state and the southern half of the state, and that's excluding the Twin Cities metro. There were some small differences there. It seemed like the northern half of the state was a bit more supportive of the president than the southern half, which actually matches with the 2016 presidential election results, and fits in with, the president has targeted mining as an issue. He's targeted pipelines, stuff like that, things that resonate in northern Minnesota. But yeah, it seems like the biggest divide is still sort of, are you in the suburbs? Are you in the cities? Are you outside of there?
Gabe, do you want to take the surprise question?
Surprise, yeah.
Were we
remain
surprised by
surprised that
anything is the question.
Were we surprised by anything? I'm surprised that anyone is not concerned about COVID, which perhaps is not as much of a surprise to anyone, but I know we had varying levels of concern. The question that we asked was, are you or someone you live with or interact with in person regularly in a health that's at high risk from the coronavirus? And, you can sort of see this trend of Democrats saying, yes, 41% of Democrats in the poll saying, yes, I'm pretty concerned, and I am included in that group. 37% for independents and 28% for Republicans and folks that lean Republican. And that gradient, right, it's impossible for that to be reflected reality. There's no way that, there are Republicans of every age group and Democrats of every group. So I remain very surprised about how people don't take coronavirus seriously.
Well, and one thing I think is also interesting, just based on the way the question was worded, is like, what do people perceive as risk? Because we know, based on like what doctors and scientists say, that like hypertension or obesity is risk, and if people don't perceive that as risk, versus like COPD or something that's a more maybe obvious risk factor. So maybe people are perceiving underlying health conditions as different risk factors, and we wouldn't know that based on the wording of the question.
But I think though, on that one thing, which of the following comes closest to your view, and I called it that actions question, and they broke it down in three groupings. One first being sort of, we must take all possible precautions to limit the spread and wait as long as it takes, sort of that one extreme. The other extreme being, everyone is making too big a deal of the coronavirus, we have to go back to our normal lives, is sort of the other side. And then the middling position of, we should start returning to work in public places soon, but we need to keep some precautions in place. So, right, one side, the other side in the middle. 41% statewide took that we should take all possible precautions, which really the state isn't doing and hasn't done for quite some time. And 28% took this sort of middling position, which is kind of where I think the state is right now, which is start to returning to work in public places, but keep precautions in place. So between those two, that's 69%. That's statewide. And even if you go into outside of the cities, 61% take the keep everything shut down and the start to reopen but take precautions, and only 38% in greater Minnesota took that we're making too big a deal of it. So kind of what I hear at the legislature and from legislators in those geographies, I guess I was kind of surprised that it wouldn't have been a higher number in greater for the too big a deal answer.
I see a question. It's about an article I wrote about how Greater Minnesota is now bearing the brunt of the state's COVID-19 death toll. Reader asked, could that hurt Trump in Minnesota? And it's a pretty interesting question. I mean, Peter touched on it at length about his story about the sort of political aspect of COVID and COVID response. I guess one thing I just will point out that's pretty interesting is Vice President Mike Pence is going to Hibbing, I think, on Monday. And in my story, we talked to St. Louis County, and they said that really there's been a huge escalation of cases on the Iron Range right now. And I think it was like 41% of all cases in greater St. Louis County, which is basically the Iron Range, have happened in October, and we're not even through October. There's been, they went from, I think, 2 deaths in September to, upwards of 20 over the last 2 months. In that area, so it's a really big escalation. But the politics are such that it still seems like people don't exactly favor like a strict lockdown in Greater Minnesota. But it is interesting to see the vice president go to a place that is experiencing sort of this escalating pandemic, and whether people will change their minds or not, I'm not really sure. But it's an interesting question, and as things get worse out in more rural areas, will they reconsider their positions on some of these questions related to COVID response? I'm not sure, but it's clear that the pandemic is getting worse outside of the Twin Cities.
Yeah, I think, should we call it? It looks like we pretty much have most of the questions answered. I tried to get these guys to do the Sound of Music sign off with me, the So Long Farewell song. They didn't sound that open to it, but we are really grateful for you all coming and listening to us. You can become a supporter of MinnPost if you like what we do, and have a great weekend.
Or even if you don't like what we do.
Or if you don't like what we do, you can become a
still,
supporter then too. All right, so long, farewell.